Welcome back. In the last segment, we talked about large ethnic communities in the Middle East and their makeup. Today, we're going to continue that discussion, beginning with smaller ethnic communities in the Middle East. These communities are very desirous of becoming nation states. However, they're not large enough to be able to bring this about without help from international help and without help from larger states and major states in international politics. So the cooperation and intervention of these bigger states would be necessary for them to be able to achieve nation statehood. Among them, probably the foremost that many of you know about or have heard about are the Kurds. The Kurds truly have a very intense desire for independence and for statehood, and that desire is so intense that they are constantly looking for any help they could get from the international community to achieve that goal. One of the families, the Kurdish families that is well known, is the Barzani family. It's a very important Kurdish family. During the Cold War, they first allied themselves with the Soviet Union, hoping that they would get their help. And then later on, they allied with the United States and its regional allies in the Middle East. Both of us, the Soviet and the Americans, sold them out. And it's a very tragic, sad story. So when we get to Iraq, and when we talk about the episode in 1974, I will talk about that more. As I said, the Kurds have a very sad history because they're right at the cusp of being able to achieve nationhood and statehood. Even more importantly, they already are a nation. These are the people that Saddam Hussein gassed during the Iran-Iraq war using chemical weapons, specifically on March 16, 1988. The estimate was that he killed somewhere between 35 to 5,000 Kurds, especially in the city of Halabja, and injured somewhere between 7,000 to 10,000. If you go on the internet and look at the pictures, the birds, every human beings, all the animals, they're all just dead as a result of the use of gas by Saddam Hussein. And by the way, that was the period in which we were supporting Saddam Hussein, and Iran strongly protested this use of chemical weapons. And President Bush, the 41st president, actually his regime ended up defending Saddam and not pursuing the case with the international bodies. The second group is the Afghans. You could make the case whether they belong to South Asia or the Middle East. But I'm, for now anyway, treating them as part of the Middle East. These are very obstreperous group of people. They don't want to be pushed around, and the British found out that they cannot push them around. The Soviet Union tried it. They couldn't push them around, and now we are learning the same lesson from our involvement. Afghanistan has been called the graveyard of empires. Every empire that has gone there has been unable to wheel them in and be able to dominate them. So they have a very strong desire for not being dominated by outside powers. Still though, the fact remains that Afghans are too divided. The Taliban, amazingly enough, came very close to creating a genuine state. In other words, state that would control all the territory. Before 9/11 in 2001, they had reached that point almost. They were controlling 90% of the territory, but then our invasion of Afghanistan in the aftermath of 9/11 led to the Taliban's defeat. So now they are trying to establish a state under President Karzai, who happens to be our ally, so the verdict is not as yet. The verdict is out. We don't know whether they're going to succeed or not. And then finally, among the smaller ethnic communities, I should mention the Baluchis. The Baluchis live in the southeast Iran and southwest Pakistan. And the problem for them, of course, is that they run into two powerful states, Iran and Pakistan. So for them to be able to get independence, they would need at least one of these states to be cooperating with them, and the chances of that happening is very small. But they do have a desire for their own statehood and independence. And then the other part of it that we need to talk about are the former Soviet Union colonies. If you recall, I mentioned that Soviet Union was the last great empire in the world which disintegrated. And these colonies that they had colonized all of that area, and they all now are independent. These are the republics of Azerbaijan, the Kazakhstan, Georgia, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzia. All of these republics have achieved statehood, and they're recognized as such. And as I argued earlier, one could make the case that they are part of the Middle East, but at least for now, we are treating them as Central Asian republics, and as I mentioned, they will not be covered in this course. It is worth mentioning that the challenge for many of these former Soviet republics that have achieved statehood is the fact that their country was colonized by Russians. So they have a lot of Russians in their midst. So for example, if you look at Kazakhstan, it's 50% Russian. So that raises a problem. And of course, any of these states, if they try to assert a great deal of independence relative to their former, vessel, which would have been Soviet Union, their former state would have been Soviet Union. If they try to assert too much independence, they would have to worry about the wrath of Soviet Union, or now Russia, to bear down on them. So Georgia, for example, has found out in a hard way that Soviet Union, the Russians would like to be, in a sense, the hegemon in the region. And then the last group are the Hebrews. And the Hebrews are an important part of the Middle East in the state of Israel, but also there have been important pockets of Jewish population throughout the Middle East, although that pocket has been dwindling over the past century or more so. Israel, in many ways, if you think about it, is a very small state. It needs really international support to maintain its independence. And that support is critical. Even though it has a very powerful armed forces, it has a difficult time projecting its power much beyond its immediate border. The fear that it will be sold out by the great powers is a real one for the Israelis, because it happens to be a common pattern in world history. So therefore, that fear, I believe, is a legitimate fear, even though today Israel's influence in the United States seems extraordinary and unparalleled. This fear, therefore, I think, is an important factor determining Israelis' foreign policy. So the challenge for Israel is, how do you maintain an international atmosphere that is conducive to your independence and also helps Arabs helps against Arab uniting and ganging up on you? So those would be the categories for the small ethnic communities. The last group that I would like to talk about are the very small ethnic communities. And these are communities that for the most part have given up the idea and the desire for independent statehood. They're just simply too small. The first category are the Syrians. The Syrians mostly live in Iraq and in Iran. As I said, many of them have migrated to the United States, and even though if it was in the cards for them to have independent statehood, many of them would have probably liked it, they know that that's not in the cards. The other group is this nomadic group called the Qashqais. They mostly inhabit the southwestern of Iran, and they too have been restive in the past, but they pretty much know that it's not going to be happening to them in terms of getting their own state. But it's an important nomadic group. And then finally, the last one are the Berbers. We mentioned them before earlier. They live mostly in North Africa, and many of them have been absorbed in the various Arab countries where they live. So this pretty much concludes my description of the various ethnic communities in the Middle East. Therefore, I like to reach a conclusion, and that conclusion really is that ethnicity happens to be a terribly important basis for nationalism as well as for identity in the Middle East. And since it is an important basis for nationalism and identity, therefore it is not surprising that it is also a very important source, provenance for inter and intrastate conflicts in the region. The next community that I'd like to talk about, the third one, is the religious community. And here we begin with Islam. Islam is the religion of the overwhelming majority of the people in the Middle East. In terms of numbers, we're looking at least 1.5 billion Muslims in the world. There are a total of 56 states throughout the globe that have a Muslim majority. And when you say a Muslim majority, you're talking about a very strong attachment to that notion of ummah, the community of the faithful that I already spoke about. Now, looking at religion, the Islam consists of really two major sects. By far the most important one is the Sunnis worldwide. The Sunnis comprise about 85% of the Muslim, and the Shiites comprise only about 15% of it. The situation, however, is a little bit, or I should say a lot, different in the Middle East. When you look at Middle East, the Sunnis are about 2/3 of the population, less than 2/3, about 63%. On the other hand, the Shiites are 37 or a little more than 37% of the population. The appeal of Islam in the area, in the region, has been evident really since the Iranian Revolution back in 1979. In many ways, the Iranian Revolution was dubbed the Islamic Revolution of Iran. So Islam has become a very strong movement, and after what we witnessed in 2011 with the Arab Awakening, we can kind of gauge the strength of Islam by noticing that after the Arab Awakening, wherever there has been a reasonably free elections, such as in Tunisia and such as in Egypt, Islamic candidates, Islamic parties have fared exceptionally well. So overall, the support for Islam as a basis for unity remains strong, at least in this juncture in history. In the longer run, this may prove to be unsustainable. For example, as more and more Islamic governments gain access to power and they become the governing elites or the governing entities, dealing with the very, very challenging economic issues may erode their popularity, because you now have to solve problems, and it's not clear that Islamicists are going to be any more successful in dealing with these economic challenges. Nevertheless, in the short run, Islam perhaps offers the best hope for unity among Muslims of the region, and remember, the region is overwhelmingly Muslim. The main problem in the path of Islamic unity or Islamic unification really is what I just alluded to in this earlier slide, and that is sectarian tendency. And the sectarian tendency means that, at least in the Middle East, there is a polarization, or there is a very strong possibility of polarization over the different sects of Islam. If you look at the Shiites community, which is about a third of Muslims in the region, you will see that 90% of Iran are Shiites. A clear majority, more than an absolute majority, 60% of both Iraq and Bahrain, are the island of Bahrain, where our Navy really uses for its port, are Shiites. And also in Lebanon, Shiites constitute the largest minority. There are important pockets of Shiites also in southeast Saudi Arabia, where the oil fields are. And of course, the question that always haunted Ayatollah Khomeini, the leader of Iran, was whether or not his Islamic revolution was Islamic, or truly Islamic, or was it a Shiite movement? And this really posed a real challenge for him to emerge as a leader of the Islamic world. Many Arabs actually saw Ayatollah Khomeini as an Iranian nationalist disguised under the Islamic banner. That certainly was the argument presented by Saddam Hussein during the Iran-Iraq war. Others actually saw him much more as a Shiite movement, and therefore it wasn't attractive to many of the Sunnis. And still others in the Arab world, they were seeing him as the best hope for any type of unification. Khomeini really strongly, I should add, played down the difference between the various sects, between the Sunnis and the Shiites, constantly reminding his followers that that kind of a division was something that the imperialists were pushing, and we should resist it. The difference is not that important, it's not that great, and the commonality is far more important and far greater. I also want to mention that there have been two spin-offs from the Shiites in the Middle East. One of them is the Alawis. Alawis are they constitute about 10% of the population of Syria. The presidents of Syria in recent years, President Assad and his son Bashar al-Assad, are part of that sect. And many Syrian top political elites are also Alawi. So a lot of the Arabs outside of Syria view this as an Alawi dictatorship. The other group are the Druze. this community actually was also a spin-off from Islam and Shiites, but in reality they have drifted so far apart that really it's hard to know whether they are Muslims or not. One group, for example, has been absorbed by Israelis, and it actually serves in the Israeli army, and some of them have actually become officers there. But there is a larger group that have some Arab nationalist tendency. They certainly had it early on during the civil war in Lebanon. But the fact of the matter is that for a lot of Druze in Lebanon and in Syria, there is a very, very strong parochial tendencies, and therefore it's a very complicated picture.